Obese millionaire sees beggar drinking from a puddle on the street, and it changes his life. Richard Thompson was used to seeing only numbers and contracts, but that Thursday, something different caught his attention when he stopped at a traffic light in downtown New York City. His life as a successful businessman had never been interrupted by something as simple as a woman on the street. Then he saw the scene that left him frozen. A middle-aged woman, dressed in dirty clothes with unkempt hair, was kneeling on the sidewalk, drinking water from a puddle that had formed after the morning rain. Her hands trembled as she brought the dirty water to her mouth with a desperate thirst Richard had never witnessed. "Dear Lord," he murmured to himself in the car, feeling his heart race. Richard's belly pressed against the steering wheel of his imported Cadillac. At 330 pounds, he could barely move comfortably in the driver's seat. His sunglasses couldn't hide the shock in his eyes. That image unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. The light turned green, but Richard couldn't lift his foot off the brake. The cars behind him began honking, but he was hypnotized watching the woman. There was something in her gestures, in the way she hunched over, that stirred a distant and painful memory in his heart. "Why can't I stop looking?" he whispered to himself, feeling a growing ache in his chest. When he finally drove away, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the scene. All morning at the office, between important meetings and million-dollar decisions, his mind kept returning to that woman drinking from the puddle. The image replayed like a film in his head. By 3 in the afternoon, Richard couldn't take it anymore. He cancelled all his meetings for the day and left the office, driving back to where he'd seen the woman. His heart pounded as if something very important was about to happen. He didn't even understand this urgency himself. Arriving downtown, Richard parked and began searching for the woman. He walked the nearby streets, sweating from his excess weight and the afternoon sun. People passed by without a glance, but Richard kept searching with a determination he didn't know he had. After an hour of walking, he found her. The woman was sitting under an awning, sharing stale pieces of bread with 3 skinny, dirty dogs. Richard hid behind a lamppost to watch. The tenderness with which she treated the animals moved him deeply. "You're hungry too, aren't you, my babies?" he heard her whisper to the dogs. "Let's share this nicely." The woman's voice was soft, full of affection, even in the midst of so much suffering. Richard felt his eyes well up. He hadn't cried in decades, but something about that scene touched a part of his heart he thought he'd lost forever. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Richard decided to approach. He took out his wallet and walked toward the woman. His steps were heavy, and he struggled to breathe under his weight. The woman looked up as he neared, and Richard saw fear in her eyes. "Don't worry, ma'am," Richard said in the gentlest voice he could muster. "I just want to help." "I don't need help," the woman replied quickly, hugging the dogs protectively. "Please leave me alone." "I saw you drinking from the puddle this morning," Richard insisted, holding out some bills. "At least take this to buy clean water." The woman looked at the money, then at Richard. Her eyes filled with tears, but there was a wounded dignity in her expression that made Richard feel small despite all his wealth. "I know you want to help," she said with a choked voice, "but I'm not a beggar. I'm just going through a hard time." "What's your name?" asked Richard, putting the money away. "Sarah," she replied hesitantly. "Sarah Miller." "I'm Richard. Richard Thompson," he introduced himself, trying to be respectful. "I'm sorry if I offended you, Mrs. Sarah. That wasn't my intention." Sarah studied Richard's face for a few seconds. There was something familiar about his eyes, but she couldn't place it. Richard also felt a strange sense of recognition, as if he'd known this woman from somewhere far away. "You remind me of someone," Sarah said softly, still petting one of the dogs. "You do too," Richard admitted, feeling a shiver. "But I can't remember where." An odd silence settled between them. Richard wanted to stay to talk more, but he could tell his presence made Sarah uncomfortable. He decided to leave, but promised himself he'd return the next day. "Mrs. Sarah," he said before leaving, "I'll come by here tomorrow. If you need anything, I'll be here." "You don't have to come back," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the city and thinking about Sarah. The 8,000-square-foot mansion felt empty and meaningless. For the first time in years, he questioned the purpose of all that wealth. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. During breakfast prepared by the maid, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. Had she found clean water to drink? Had the dogs eaten anything? These worries were entirely new to him. Richard arrived at the office, but his mind was elsewhere. During an important meeting with Japanese investors, he caught himself picturing Sarah drinking from a puddle. The image unsettled him in a way he didn't understand. "Mr. Thompson," his assistant Michael called, "the investors are waiting for your response on the project." "Sorry," Richard said, snapping back to reality. "Could you repeat the question?" After the meeting, Richard pulled Michael aside. Michael had worked with him for 15 years and knew his habits well. He'd never seen his boss so distracted and troubled. "Michael, I need to leave early today," Richard said. "Cancel my afternoon appointments." "Of course, sir. Are you feeling all right? You seem worried." "I'm fine," Richard lied. "Just have something important to take care of." Richard returned to the city center, this time bringing bottles of water and some bread he'd bought along the way. He found Sarah in the same spot, still with the 3 dogs. This time, she didn't seem surprised to see him. "I told you I'd come back," Richard said, approaching slowly. "I didn't think you would," Sarah admitted, accepting the water he offered. "I couldn't stop thinking about you all night," Richard confessed. "That's never happened to me before." Sarah drank the water gratefully, and Richard noticed how thin she was. Her cheekbones were sharp, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. Her situation was far worse than he'd imagined. "How long have you been on the streets?" Richard asked carefully. 2 years, Sarah murmured, giving water to the dogs. "But I don't like talking about it." "I understand," Richard said, sitting on the ground beside her. "Do you mind if I stay here a while?" Sarah shook her head. Richard looked at his expensive clothes and, for the first time, didn't care if they got dirty. Sitting there with Sarah felt more important than any business meeting. For the next 2 hours, they talked about simple things. Sarah talked about the dogs, how she had found each one of them, how she made sure they never went hungry. Richard spoke about his company, but realized that talking about money and business sounded hollow compared to Sarah's real struggles. "Do you have family?" Sarah asked. "No," Richard replied, feeling a weight in his chest. "I never married, no children. My life has always been just work." "How sad," Sarah said sincerely. "Family is the most important thing in the world." "Do you have family?" Sarah fell silent for a long time, stroking one of the dogs. Richard realized he had touched on a painful subject and regretted the question. "I had a brother," Sarah finally said, her voice breaking, "but he left me a long time ago." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way Sarah spoke about her brother that stirred a hazy memory in his mind. An image of a little girl crying, calling out for him, began forming in his thoughts. "What was your brother like?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "Older than me," Sarah answered, wiping a tear. "He promised he'd get rich and come back for me, but he never did." Richard's heart raced. His hands began to shake and he felt dizzy. That story, that voice, those gestures, it all started making sense in a terrifying way. He tried to remember his sister's name, one he had tried to forget for so many years. "What was your brother's name?" he managed to ask, his voice faltering. "Richard," Sarah whispered. "Richard Miller." The world stopped for Richard Thompson. The last name was different, but he had changed his when he became wealthy. Miller was his poor family's name, the one he had been ashamed of. Memories flooded back like an avalanche. The small house on the outskirts, his sick mother, the promise he had made to his little sister before leaving to seek his fortune in the big city. "Sari," Richard whispered, using the childhood nickname. Sarah's eyes snapped up as if she'd been shocked. It was the first time in 30 years anyone had called her that. Her eyes widened as she really looked at the man before her. "It can't be," she murmured, covering her face with her hands. "It's me, Sari," Richard said, tears streaming down his face. "Your brother Richard." Sarah froze for a few seconds, processing the words. Then, deep anger flashed in her eyes. She stood quickly, backing away from Richard, as if he were a threat. "You're not my brother," she shouted, her voice raw with decades of abandonment. "My brother would have come back. My brother wouldn't have left me alone when our mother got sick." "Sarah, please, let me explain," Richard begged, struggling to stand because of his weight. "No," Sarah kept shouting, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "You abandoned me. You promised you'd come back rich to get me, but you never did. Our mother died calling your name." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. His mother had passed, and he hadn't even known. All the guilt he had buried for years surged up at once. He felt like the most wretched man alive, despite all his wealth. "I looked for you." Richard tried to defend himself, but his voice was weak. "I went back to the neighborhood, but you weren't there anymore." "We got evicted," Sarah screamed through tears. "We had no money for rent. We ended up on the streets, Richard. I took care of our sick mother on the streets." Richard's legs gave out. He leaned against a lamppost to keep from falling. The image of his sick mother on the streets, his little sister caring for her alone, was more than he could bear. All his wealth, all his success, everything seemed like a cruel joke compared to the suffering his family had endured. "I didn't know," whispered Richard. "I swear I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Sarah snapped bitterly. "You were too busy getting rich to remember us." Sarah called the dogs and quickly walked away from Richard. He tried to follow, but she turned and shouted at him to stay back. Richard stood there in the street, feeling the weight of 30 years of guilt crushing his chest. That night, Richard couldn't bring himself to go home. He drove around the city until dawn, crying and reliving every detail of his childhood. He remembered the day he left home at 18, promising Sarah, then just 15, that he'd return rich in 2 years to take them away. The early years in the big city were tough. Richard worked construction as a street vendor, anything he could find. When he started making some money, he went back to the old neighborhood, but the house was empty. The neighbors said they'd moved, but no one knew where. Richard kept searching for a few months, but then got swallowed up by business. He met influential people, began investing in real estate, and little by little forgot his original mission. Money changed his appearance, his habits, even his last name. He became Richard Thompson, successful businessman, and buried Richard Miller, the poor boy who had a family. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. In the days that followed, Richard couldn't focus on work. He cancelled important meetings, lost valuable contracts, but none of it mattered. His mind was entirely fixed on Sarah and how to fix the mistake he'd made. He hired a private investigator to look into Sarah's life over the years. The report he received was devastating. Sarah had been a public school teacher for 15 years, a dedicated professional beloved by her students. She married at 25 to a man named Michael Johnson, but he abandoned her when she developed a degenerative disease that affected her motor skills. The illness forced Sarah into early retirement with a meager pension. Alone and unable to work, she lost her home, the few belongings she had, and ended up on the streets. The investigator also discovered that Sarah had sought help from several companies in the city, including Richard's, but was always turned away at reception. That last detail nearly drove Richard mad. His own sister had knocked on his company's door asking for help, and he never even knew. The reception staff, following his instructions not to let just anyone upstairs, had kept Sarah from reaching him. Richard decided he needed to find a way to reconnect with Sarah, but he knew she wouldn't forgive him easily. He considered several strategies until an idea struck him. He bought a puppy from a pet store and returned to the spot where Sarah usually stayed. "Miss Sarah," he called from a distance, holding the puppy. "Please, I need your help." Sarah eyed him suspiciously, but when she saw the small, frightened dog in his arms, her expression softened slightly. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. "I found this abandoned puppy," Richard lied. "He's sick and I don't know what to do. I saw how well you care for dogs and thought you might help." Sarah cautiously approached and examined the puppy. Richard had picked an animal that genuinely needed care to make his lie more convincing. The puppy was thin and had a few minor injuries. "He needs special food and medicine," said Sarah, carefully picking up the animal in her arms. "It's going to be expensive." "I'll pay whatever it takes," Richard said quickly. "I just want him to be okay." Sarah hesitated. It was clear she wanted nothing to do with Richard, but she also couldn't abandon an animal in need. Her compassionate nature outweighed her resentment. "All right," she finally said. "But this changes nothing between us." Over the following weeks, Richard visited Sarah every day to care for the puppy together. He paid for the medicine and special food, and little by little he earned Sarah's trust. She showed impressive knowledge about animal care, the result of years volunteering at shelters. Richard used these visits to observe his sister more closely. He noticed her hands trembled from her illness, that she tired easily, yet she never stopped caring for the animals with tenderness. Her dedication moved him, and at the same time, shamed him for his own empty life. One day, while tending to the puppy, Richard had a high blood pressure crisis. His excessive weight, sedentary lifestyle, and the emotional stress of recent days had taken their toll. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and he collapsed on the sidewalk. Despite her physical limitations, Sarah was the one who helped him. She applied the first aid techniques she'd learned as a teacher, kept Richard conscious, and called for an ambulance. On the way to the hospital, she held his hand, and Richard realized that despite everything, his sister still cared for him. At the hospital, the doctors warned Richard about his critical condition. At 330 pounds, with uncontrolled high blood pressure and heart problems, he wouldn't survive another 5 years if he didn't drastically change his habits. Alone in his room, Richard cried, realizing how empty and meaningless his life had become. To his surprise, Sarah appeared at the hospital the next morning. She brought him fruit and sat silently by his bed. Richard was moved by her presence but couldn't bring himself to speak about the past. "How are you?" Sarah asked softly. "Physically stable," Richard replied, emotionally shattered. "The doctor said you need to lose weight urgently." "I know," Richard sighed, "but I don't know if I have the strength. My whole life is just work and food. I have nothing, no one, to motivate me to live better." Sarah stayed quiet for a few minutes, watching Richard. Despite all the hurt, she could still see the frightened boy he'd once been, lost inside that obese, unhappy body. "You built an empire," she finally said, "but you lost your soul in the process." "I know," Richard admitted. "I have money to buy anything, but nothing that's worth anything. No real friends, no family, no purpose." "You had family," Sarah corrected bitterly. "You chose to abandon them." "I know there's no excuse," Richard said, tears in his eyes, "but I was so young, so ambitious. I thought money would fix everything, that I could come back rich and make up for lost time." "Our mother waited for you until her last day," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Even when she was very sick, she kept saying you'd come back." Richard felt his heart shatter. The image of his sick mother waiting for him hurt more than any health problem he faced. He had failed the two most important people in his life. "How did she—" Richard couldn't finish the question. "Pneumonia," Sarah answered. "We didn't have money for proper treatment. She was calling your name when she passed." Richard wept as he hadn't since childhood. All the success in the world meant nothing compared to the pain of losing his mother, without a chance to say goodbye, without a chance to ask for forgiveness. Sarah also cried, remembering the difficult moments she had endured alone. "I'm so sorry," said Richard between sobs. "I'm truly sorry, Sarah." "I'm sorry too," replied Sarah. "I'm sorry for holding on to so much hatred all these years. The hatred consumed me just as much as greed consumed you." That conversation changed something between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. Richard was discharged from the hospital 2 days later with an extensive list of medical recommendations and strong medication to control his blood pressure. Upon leaving the hospital, Richard made an important decision. He sold his mansion and moved to a simple apartment in the city center, close to where Sarah used to stay. He also started a strict diet and light exercise, determined to improve his health. During this time, Richard discovered something devastating about his business. His accountant, Gregory Wilson, had been embezzling company funds for years. Worse, several donations Richard believed he had made to charities never reached their intended recipients. The money ended up in Gregory's personal accounts. The discovery shook Richard deeply, not just because of the money, but because he realized his negligence in managing the business had allowed funds meant to help those in need to be stolen. How many people had gone without help because of his irresponsibility? Richard confronted Gregory in his office. The accountant, realizing he had been caught, tried to blackmail him by threatening to expose old tax evasion schemes they had done together. Richard faced a dilemma: protect his fortune or do the right thing. "You can report me," Richard told Gregory. "I'll accept the consequences of my mistakes, but you will return every penny you stole." "Are you crazy?" Gregory laughed. "If I go down, you go down with me. Think carefully about what you're doing." "I already have," Richard replied firmly. "I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and complicit with a thief." Richard fired Gregory and reported him to the authorities. He also confessed his own tax irregularities and committed to paying all overdue fines and taxes. The process cost Richard nearly half his fortune, but he felt relieved to have cleared his conscience. Meanwhile, Sarah faced a new crisis. One of the dogs she cared for, the oldest of them, was seriously ill and needed an expensive surgery. Sarah couldn't afford the procedure and was desperate watching the animal suffer. Richard learned about the situation through an employee at the animal shelter where he had started volunteering. Without Sarah knowing, he anonymously paid for the dog's surgery. When Sarah found out, she confronted Richard angrily. "How dare you do this?" she shouted. "I don't need your charity." "It wasn't charity," Richard replied calmly. "It was gratitude. You saved my life in the hospital, Sarah. You were the first person in years who truly cared about me." "I saved a stranger's life," Sarah said stubbornly. "Not yours." "To me, there's no difference," Richard said, "because even if you never forgive me, you're still my sister, and I'll take care of you whether you like it or not." Sarah was speechless. As much as she tried to hold on to her anger, she could see Richard had changed. He was thinner, humbler, more human. But she still wasn't ready to fully forgive him. A few weeks later, a severe storm hit New York City. The makeshift shelter where Sarah stayed with the dogs collapsed in the rain. Sarah was injured protecting the animals from the debris and was found semi-conscious by Richard, who had gone looking for her as soon as the storm began. Richard took Sarah to the hospital and personally cared for the dogs while she recovered. For the first time in his life, he experienced what it meant to have real responsibility for other living beings. The experience changed him deeply. During the 2 months Sarah was hospitalized, Richard visited the hospital every day and took care of the animals every night. He lost 40 pounds in that time, driven by the need to stay healthy so he could keep helping. His life gained a purpose that money had never given him. When Sarah was discharged, she found Richard unrecognizable. He had lost weight, looked younger, happier. The dogs ran to him as if he had always been their owner, and Sarah realized how much he had dedicated himself to caring for them. "You took good care of them," Sarah said, watching the healthy, happy animals. "They taught me more about love in 2 months than I learned in 50 years, Richard replied. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." Sarah sat beside Richard, and they stayed quiet, watching the dogs play. It was the first time in decades they had been together, without tension, without anger, just sharing a moment of peace. "You've changed," Sarah said softly. "You changed me," Richard answered. "You and these animals showed me what it means to love without expecting anything in return." "I still haven't completely forgiven you," Sarah admitted honestly. "I know," Richard said, "and I don't expect you to. I just hope I can prove every day that I'm a better person now." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. In the months that followed, Richard and Sarah developed a routine of caring for the animals together. Richard had sold his company and now lived off safer investments, dedicating most of his time to volunteer work. Sarah, despite the limitations of her illness, remained a devoted caretaker. One day, While walking the dogs in the park, Sarah had an episode of her degenerative disease. The tremors grew stronger and she lost her balance, falling to the ground. Richard rushed to help her and took her to the hospital. Tests revealed that Sarah's condition had progressed more than expected. She would need specialized and expensive treatment to slow the symptoms. Without hesitation, Richard offered to pay for everything, but Sarah refused. "I won't accept your help," she said stubbornly. "Why not?" Richard asked, frustrated. "Would you let your condition worsen out of pride?" "It's not pride," Sarah explained. "It's fear. Fear of getting used to you again and you abandoning me once more." Richard finally understood the root of the problem. Sarah wasn't just hurt by the past abandonment, she was afraid of being left again. The trust they had rebuilt was still fragile. "Sari," Richard said, holding her hands, "I swear on our mother's memory that I'll never leave you again. You don't have to forgive me, you don't have to trust me, but I'll be here, always." Sarah looked into Richard's eyes and saw the sincerity that had been missing 30 years before. Slowly, she agreed to let him pay for the treatment. It was the first step in rebuilding trust between them. During Sarah's treatment, Richard met other patients and their families. He saw the desperation of those who couldn't afford expensive medications, the pain of families selling everything to cover medical costs. That reality moved him deeply. Richard decided to create a fund to help underprivileged patients pay for medical treatments. He invested a large portion of his remaining fortune into the project, working directly with hospitals and clinics to identify those in need. Sarah was amazed by Richard's dedication to the cause. He worked 12 hours a day, visited patients, organized charity events, did everything personally. It was as if he were trying to make up for decades of selfishness with years of generosity. "You don't need to punish yourself like this," Sarah said one day, seeing Richard exhausted after another intense day of work. "I'm not punishing myself," Richard replied. "I'm finally living. For the first time in my life, I wake up knowing I'm going to do something that matters." "And your company? Your businesses?" "I sold everything," Richard said simply. "I don't need that much money. I have enough to live well and still help many people." Sarah was speechless. The man who had abandoned his family in pursuit of wealth had willingly given up nearly everything he owned to help strangers. The transformation seemed impossible, but it was happening right before her eyes. 6 months later, Sarah had a serious relapse of her illness. She developed a severe infection due to her weakened immune system and was hospitalized in critical condition. The doctors weren't optimistic about her chances of recovery. Richard never left the hospital during the 3 weeks Sarah hovered between life and critical condition. He slept on the room's sofa, helped the nurses with her care, and talked to her even when she was unconscious. The doctors were impressed by his dedication. During her delirious moments, Sarah called out for the brother who had abandoned her. She didn't recognize Richard by her bedside and spoke as if she was still the 15-year-old girl waiting for him to return. Richard held her hand and promised he would never leave her alone again. "Richard, where are you?" Sarah murmured in her moments of confusion. "You promised you'd come back." "I'm right here, Sari," Richard replied with tears in his eyes. "I came back. I'll never leave your side again." When Sarah finally improved and regained consciousness, she found Richard beside her, holding her hand. He was thinner, with deep bags under his eyes, but his face lit up with relief when he saw her awake. "You stayed here the whole time?" Sarah asked weakly. "I promised I'd never abandon you again," Richard replied, "and I keep my promises now." Sarah studied Richard's face. She saw the exhaustion, the genuine concern, the brotherly love that had been hidden all those years. For the first time since recognizing him on the street, she felt she could trust him again. "Richard," she said softly, "I forgive you." Richard broke down in tears. Those 3 words lifted decades of guilt from his shoulders. He kissed Sarah's forehead and held her hand tenderly, just as he used to when they were children and she had nightmares. Sarah's recovery was slow but steady. Richard stayed by her side through every step, learning about her illness, helping with physical therapy, and adjusting their routine to her needs. They began living together in a simple but cozy apartment. During this time, they talked a lot about the past. Richard told her about his difficult early years in the big city, how he had searched for them without success, how greed had gradually blinded him to what truly mattered. Sarah spoke about the years spent caring for their sick mother, her failed marriage, and her battle with illness. "You know what hurt me the most?" Sarah said one night as they sorted through old photos Richard had kept. "What?" "It wasn't you leaving to build a better life. It was you forgetting where you came from, even changing your last name, as if our family was something to be ashamed of." Richard felt the weight of her words. It was true. He had been ashamed of his humble origins, had tried to erase Richard Miller to become Richard Thompson. But in doing so, he had erased the best parts of himself too. "I want to be Richard Miller again," he said. "Legally, officially, I want to reclaim my true identity." "Are you sure?" asked Sarah, surprised. "I am. Richard Thompson was a lie I told myself. Richard Miller is who I really am." Richard began the process of changing his name back to the original. It was an important symbolic gesture for both of them, representing a return to their true roots and values. A few months later, Richard had an idea that would change their lives once more. He proposed to Sarah that they create a shelter together, one that would offer not just refuge, but dignity for vulnerable people and animals. "It would be a place where people could rebuild their lives," Richard explained enthusiastically, "with job training workshops, medical care, space for animals, a place where no one would be just a number or a lost cause." Sarah was moved by the idea. It was exactly the kind of place she would have needed when she lost everything, a place where human dignity was respected, where people could start over without losing their self-worth. They invested Richard's remaining resources into the project. They bought a large plot of land on the outskirts of New York City and began construction. Richard worked physically on the site, losing more weight and gaining muscle. Sarah, within her limitations, coordinated the educational programs and support services. The construction took 8 months to complete. During that time, Richard and Sarah reconnected, not just as siblings, but as partners in a shared purpose. They complemented each other's skills, Richard with his experience in management and resources, Sarah with her background in education and caregiving. The center opened on a sunny Saturday in October. Dozens of people attended the inauguration. Homeless individuals Richard had helped, patients who benefited from the medical fund he created, volunteers from the animal shelters where they worked. During the opening ceremony, Richard gave an emotional speech. He shared his story of transformation and thanked his sister for giving him back not just his family, but his soul. Sarah, in turn, spoke about the importance of never giving up on people, of how it's always possible to start again. "My brother taught me it's never too late to change," Sarah told the audience, "and I taught him it's never too late to forgive. Together, we learned it's never too late to begin again." The center thrived quickly. It offered dignified dormitories, nutritious meals, job training workshops, psychological support, and basic medical care. There was also a special space for abandoned animals, where homeless individuals could stay with their companions. Richard and Sarah lived on site, working daily to ensure every person was treated with respect and kindness. Richard had lost 60 pounds and become a completely different man, both physically and emotionally. Sarah, despite her illness, found a new purpose in life. A year after opening, the center had already helped over 300 people and 200 animals. Many found jobs and housing, while others became volunteers helping new arrivals. The project became a citywide model for compassionate care. One December evening, Richard and Sarah sat in the center's garden, watching people share dinner in the communal dining hall. There were reunited families, new friendships, and daily stories of resilience that moved them deeply. "Do you regret anything?" Sarah asked. "I regret taking so long to find my way back to you," Richard replied, "but I don't regret the hardships we faced. They brought us here." "I don't regret it either," said Sarah. "Our suffering served a greater purpose. Now we can help others avoid getting lost like we did." Richard took Sarah's hand and squeezed it gently. After decades apart due to pride, greed, and resentment, they had finally found their way back to each other. More than that, They had found a shared purpose that gave meaning to all the pain they had endured. "Sari," Richard said, "our mother would be proud of us." "I'm sure she would," Sarah replied, tears in her eyes. "We finally kept the promise we made when we were little." "What promise?" "To take care of each other and all those abandoned by the world." Richard smiled, remembering that childhood promise he had forgotten for so many years. Now, at 50 years old, he was finally fulfilling the vow he had made when he was just 8. The center kept growing, helping more and more people. Richard and Sarah grew old together, working side by side, caring for each other and everyone in need. They proved it's never too late to start over, to forgive, and to turn pain into love. 2 years after its opening, the center received visits from authorities and organizations from other states interested in replicating the model. Richard and Sarah traveled across the country, sharing their story and teaching others how to create similar spaces. During one of these trips, as they returned to New York City, they passed by the spot where they had reunited 3 years earlier. The puddle was no longer there, but they stopped the car and sat in silence for a few minutes, remembering how much had changed. "If someone had told me 3 years ago that I'd be this happy, I wouldn't have believed it," Sarah said. "Neither would I," Richard agreed. "I had everything and yet nothing. Now I have little, but I have everything." They returned to the center, where a surprise party awaited them. It was Richard's birthday, though he had completely forgotten. The staff and residents had prepared a simple but heartfelt celebration. During the party, Richard looked around and saw the smiling faces of people who had once been lost, but now had hope again. He saw Sarah chatting animatedly with a child whose parents were rebuilding their lives at the center. He saw the dogs she loved so much playing with other children. At that moment, Richard understood he had found true wealth. It wasn't in the millions he had accumulated, but in the lives he was helping to transform. It wasn't in the business awards he had won, but in the grateful smile of every person who walked through the center's doors. Before going to sleep that night, Richard wrote in his personal journal, "Today I turned 52, but I feel like my real life only began 3 years ago when I found my sister drinking from a puddle on the street. That image saved me from an empty, purposeless life. Today I am whole. I have family, friends, and work I love. I am truly rich." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of transformation and new beginnings. Do you believe Richard made the right choices by giving up his fortune to reconnect with his sister? How would you react if you found a long-lost relative after decades apart? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss other moving stories like this one.